Hey Stitchers, I hope you're having a good day wherever you're watching this from in the world. Today's video I thought I would finally get around to doing my Heaven and Earth sort of hints and tips video really. It's sort of about the things that have helped me stitch these designs and some different things you might not have thought of doing, especially if you're new to Heaven and Earth designs. Obviously everybody approaches these designs differently. I'm going to be talking about the things that help me, which isn't to say that what I do is right, it's just the way I do things, it's what suits my stitching best. I really believe that with stitching, 95% of stitching is doing what suits you best. The other 5% is just making sure the top stitches of your crosses go in the same direction. So there's such so many different ways to approach stitching these designs, so I'll cover a few of them, including some of the things that I do. I think for new stitchers these designs can be quite daunting really, because there's no set formula. You can stitch on any fabric, you can, deciding what number of strands to use when you stitch. There's such a variety that I think some people just like to have a set formula. They want to know that you stitch 2 over 1 on 25 count, and they don't like the sort of array of choice there is. So I just talk about a few of those, the sort of options, the things that you can do to make these designs perhaps a bit easier for you to stitch and all those type of things. So this video has potential to go on for quite a long time, so I'm putting out that warning now, but I've got three of my top tips for stitching these designs. So if all you do is listen to those three and then switch off, that's absolutely fine. So the first one, my first top tip, I highly recommend to anybody who's stitching one of these designs that they join their Heaven and Earth bulletin board on Yuku. The amount of information about stitching those designs contained in that forum is absolutely priceless. Everything I've learnt and know about stitching those designs I've learnt from that forum, from other stitchers sharing their experiences with me. So even if you're not the type of stitcher that likes to post on forums, the information on there is just worth joining that forum just for that. Any question, every question that's ever been asked about a Heaven and Earth design has been asked and answered on that forum. The same questions come up for all new Heaven and Earth design stitchers, and they're all answered there. So it's a fantastic source of information. The other thing is there's obviously hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of whip and finish pictures, photos that stitchers have taken of their progress and their finished pieces. So it's fantastic for seeing how these designs stitch up, the detail in the designs. You will know from my Heaven and Earth finishes video that I did that I like to stitch mini designs. I think they've been around for sort of about a year or so now, I can't remember, so obviously more stitchers are completing them. So again, it's a good place to go to see how a mini of a certain chart stitches up in comparison to the full-size version, to see if there's any sort of detail lost, or if you feel that it makes no difference to you and you'll go with the mini because it's going to take you a shorter time to stitch. So there's just so much on that bulletin board that I would really recommend anybody that's interested in these designs to apply to join the bulletin board. The link for it is on the Heaven and Earth's main website. I'll put that up under the video in case you wanted to have a look to see all the things that are available on that bulletin board. So that's the first one. Second, it seems really obvious, but stitch a design that you love. Choose a design that you can't live without. Obviously, if you choose a full-size chart, even if you're a one-at-a-time stitcher, it's going to take you, however fast you are, especially if it's one of the big ones, sort of the Amy Stewart bookshelf designs. They're about, I don't know how many pages, 70, 80, 90 pages, I don't know, depending on what size chart you've chosen. So it's going to take you a few years to stitch. So make sure you pick a design which at the end of 2, 3, 4, 5 years of stitching it, you don't look at it and think, oh, actually, I'm not that keen on it anymore. Also, if you pick a design that you love, you're more motivated to stitch it. These designs, obviously take a long time, and sometimes you do get a bit sort of sick of doing them. I do sometimes. I go through phases. But the thought of being able to have a finish of that beautiful artwork that you love, I find that really motivates me to carry on stitching. Some stitchers might think, which is perfectly fine, might think, I'll start off with a quick stitch or a story keep. I'll find a small design which, you know, is a good idea, but just make sure it's a design that you love, because at the end of the day, whether you stitch an SK, QS, mini or a full-size chart, it's just little cross stitches. That's all it is. Just more cross stitches in one than another. So don't necessarily go for the smallest chart just because you think it will be a quicker stitch, because if you don't like it, you won't stitch on it. So that's the second obvious one. Pick a chart you love and that you won't sort of grow out of. The third one, which is actually probably the most important, and I cannot emphasise enough how important this is, and that is to test stitch your fabrics. Now obviously if you regularly stitch on 2/1 on 18 count AIDA, and that's what you want to stitch your Heaven and Earth designs on, you know, obviously you don't need to do any test stitching. But if you're deciding to use a fabric count that you've perhaps never used before, you've never stitched 25 count over 1, and you just think, oh, I'll go along with the recommendation, I'll stitch 25 count 2/1, you might not like it. I say that because, as you all know, and I probably say this a million times throughout this video, you can stitch a Heaven and Earth design on absolutely any count of fabric that you wish. The recommendation is just that, a recommendation. Why they use that particular combination, I don't know. It's what the floss usage chart is done for. So when you look at the floss usage count, that is the amount of floss you will need if you stitch the design on 25 count, 2 strands over 1 thread of fabric. Quite a few stitches have gone along with that recommendation. Well, not quite a few. Several stitches I know have gone along with that recommendation, and they've got 2-3 pages into their design and just couldn't hack it anymore. It was doing their head in. Especially for some stitches, if you stitch with 2 strands on 25 count over 1, you might find it incredibly hard to push the needle through the fabric because it does get quite bulky, especially if there's a lot of confetti stitching, by which I mean single stitches of lots of different colours in maybe one 10 by 10 block of stitching. And obviously they've got to the point when they just can't go on anymore, so either means that that project gets sidelined, never to be stitched again because they can't bear the sight of it, or they love the chart and they restart it. So for the sake of maybe an hour sitting doing a bit of test stitching, trying out different fabric counts, crosses, half stitches, tent stitches, for the sake of that 1 hour, that's sort of 3 months possibly work that's gone down the drain. I can't emphasise enough that test stitching on fabric, on your fabric choice, is not a waste of time. It can save you an awful lot of time and heartache in the long run. I know when I started looking to do bigger sized Heaven and Earth designs on smaller counts of fabric, what I did, in the UK there's a company run by Donna, she's a Heaven and Earth design stitcher herself. She does little sample packs of fabric. Included in them are 22 count, 25 count linen, 25 count Lugana and 25 count Magic Guide Ada, I think, not Ada, 25 count Magic Guide Even Weave, that's off the top of my head. I ordered one of those little sample packs. Basically she doesn't charge you for the fabric, she just charges you for the postage of sending the fabric out. And I sat there for, you know, an hour or so, just doing different combinations, two strands of floss, 1 strand of floss, full cross, tent stitch, and it was actually quite surprising what I preferred. I thought that I'd be fine tent stitching 2/1. When I did it, I didn't like it, the coverage wasn't good enough for me. So then I did some test stitching, 2/1 tent stitch on 28 count, and I just loved it. So I'm really glad that I took that time to do some test stitching. So, and I think if you ask any Heaven and Earth design stitcher, especially on the forum, that would be the #1 piece of advice for a new Heaven and Earth stitcher, to test stitch on your fabric. So now for the rest of my waffle. So I apologise for how long this will go on for, I have no idea, but I'm hoping that you'll find what I have to say useful. Obviously, as I go through different things, if you have any further questions or there's something I haven't covered, just please post in a comment, and if I don't know the answer, I'll find it from somewhere and I'll get back to you. So please bear that in mind. Don't be afraid to ask any questions. So let's start with fabric. That's the one, probably the question that gets asked the most. What fabric should I stitch my head on? Oh, by the way, instead of saying Heaven and Earth Designs, I'm going to say head, because that's what I say, my head, when I read it. So some of you pronounce it differently, so if you hear me say head, that's what I'm talking about. I just thought I'd clear that up. Anyway, yeah, so what fabric should you stitch on? Well, the answer is whatever fabric you like, which isn't very helpful in a lot of ways, because there's so many out there. Obviously, you can stitch on HAED, you can stitch on even weave, you can stitch on linen. On the bulletin board, I have seen designs stitched 2 over, well, no, not 2 over 1. I've seen designs stitched over 2 on 14 count with 6 strands, so that's the equivalent to 9 count, well, binker it would be. So I've seen from that extreme right the way up to somebody stitching on 36 count over 1. So you really can stitch one of these designs on any count of fabric. Obviously some stitches might have to take into consideration their eyesight. They don't want to put strain on their eyes. So many stitchers stitch these designs on 18 count HAED, even, you know, the big, not just QSs like I've done in the past, but even the big designs, and they look amazing. People worry about sort of a loss, you know, sort of loss of detail, but all it really means is the design is bigger, so you might just have to take a few steps back to appreciate, you know, the whole design in full. So there really isn't a problem with making these designs bigger or smaller. Not that I've seen any evidence of on all the pictures, photographs that I've seen of people's finishes of these designs. So obviously, for a lot of stitchers, when they first stitch a Heaven and Earth design, it might be the first time they've stitched on even weave. So that's something to take into consideration. Obviously, the highest, I always get confused with saying highest or lowest, the finest count of HAED is 22 count. Although it's not called HAED, because technically it isn't, but it's a block weave like HAED. HAED fabric is woven with 4 strands, or 4 threads of fabric. Hardanger 22 count fabric is woven with 2 strands of fabric. So they're block weave fabric. So a lot of stitchers like to try out 22 count Hardanger fabric because it gives them the safety of a block weave, so they don't have to worry about their stitches perhaps slipping under the weave of the fabric, as can sometimes happen on even weave if you have a very tight tension when you stitch. But 22 count gives them that finer look, and obviously, you know, the bigger the piece of fabric that you use, the more it's going to cost to frame, things like that. That's always a good thing to take into consideration, and also the amount of fabric, how you're going to cope with stitching it. You know, if you've got some of the pieces are massive, almost metre of fabric you need. So there's lots of things to take into consideration. I know one of the things that I took in consideration was the size of the piece and the framing costs. So obviously if you're worried about stitching on even weave, you feel you're not quite ready for that, then 22 count Hardanger is a good option to perhaps consider, do a bit of test stitching on. Then of course you've got 25 count, 28 count fabrics. You know that I like to stitch 2 over 1/10 stitch on 28 count fabric. The other thing to consider with fabric is not just the count of the fabric, it's also the composition of the fabric. I can't explain this, but I prefer to stitch my Heaven and Earth designs on 28 count Brittany or 28 count Lugana. It's the same fabric depending on what side of the Atlantic you live on. Although I love stitching with linen, you've seen the finishes I've stitched on linen, I find for me personally linen isn't a good fabric for me to stitch these designs on. The strength of the fabric, the way it can sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? Warp, possibly, potentially, especially with tent stitching, I find that linen isn't a good choice for me. Again, Jobelan, however you want to say it, is another of my favourite fabrics that I've used to stitch my Chatelaines on, but it's not a fabric that I would choose to use for my Heaven and Earth designs. That's just me. I think Jobelan is a thicker, there's a thickness about it. The holes aren't as clear and as easy to see as on Brittany Lugana. So that's why I haven't stitched ahead on that particular fabric. So those are other things to take into consideration. Personally, I think Lugana is a great fabric to stitch a heaven and earth design on. The holes of the fabric are quite clear and easy to see. I find it funny that the fabric that they recommend often on the heaven and earth designs charts is 25 count Dublin linen. I think if you did a poll of what stitchers stitch these designs on, I think that would be the least popular fabric used. Some stitchers love it, of course, and that's absolutely fine. But for the same reasons that I've mentioned, the fact that the fabric can warp, possibly it's not quite as strong. Obviously with linen, you've got the slubs possibly in the fabric, the different thicknesses of the thread could perhaps alter, make it more difficult to stitch, because obviously you're stitching tiny little uniform stitches. But again, if you stitch your heaven and earth designs on linen, you know, absolutely fine. It's very hard to do these type of videos without, I don't want you to think that the way I stitch, I think that's the right way. It's not. However you do it is absolutely fine. But these, for newer stitchers, these are just some things to take into consideration, which is why, again, I will say it again, test stitching is an excellent way to find out what fabric works for you and for your stitching the best. Whatever fabric you choose, your design will be beautiful. So as long as you're happy with it, because obviously you're going to be stitching on this for an awfully long time, possibly, if you stitch one of the bigger BAPs. So it's always best to, you know, that's why I say it's best to test stitch, and then you know that you're happy with your choice and it's not a chore to stitch these designs, because that is the last thing you want, is for your stitching to be a chore, to feel that you have to stitch a certain way because of the fabric you're using. So definitely go with that. The other thing to consider, as well as the count and the composition of the fabric, bizarrely, is the colour. It's something that you might not think of. You think, oh right, white fabric, let's go for that. But obviously if your design's got a lot of white stitching in it, it's quite hard to stitch white on white. So you might want to go for another neutral shade, perhaps off-white, obviously there is, cream, I know Jobelan comes in bone, potato, all these sort of neutral colour fabrics. You might want to go for a grey, a dove grey, something like that, just to make it a bit easier on your eyes really, especially when you're stitching on very fine counts of fabric. So don't necessarily always go for white. If you feel it will help you to use a different colour, make your stitches easier to see, then, you know, consider stitching on a different colour of fabric. And of course you can always stitch on hand-dyed fabrics, you know. The choice really is endless. So that's fabric. So for fabric, consider the count, the composition and the colour. Now for threads. Probably the second most asked question on the bulletin board will be, how many threads or floss? How many strands of floss should I use? And again, the answer is whatever works best for your stitching. There is no magic formula. I know for me, one of the things that I considered when I was deciding this was I wanted to use 2 strands of thread, purely so I could use the loop method of starting my threads each time. So it was kind of a given that I would only want to use 2 strands of floss. I didn't want to use 1 strand. I didn't want the fuss of, it's just, for me, I like starting with the loop method. It just makes it easier, cuts down on the bulk of your fabric, bulk of your thread, which is something to consider with heaven and earth designs, because the backs can get quite bulky with fabric, especially if you've got a lot of confetti in the design that you've chosen to do. So that for me was important. So I only test stitched then with 2 strands of fabric, 2 strands of thread, which obviously as soon as I did a bit of test stitching on 25 count with full cross with 2 strands of thread, that looked awful. My stitching looks so bulky. It does depend on your tension. I think my tension with stitching probably quite loose. Other stitches have quite a tight tension, so you know, there are some stitchers that are really happy stitching 2/1 on 25 count because it suits their style of stitching, and that's absolutely fine. The important thing is to do what's right for you. You can convince me till you're blue in the face that stitching on 25 count 2/1 is the best thing since sliced bread, but I know for my stitching it isn't, because I've tried it. So really, that if you take nothing away from me waffling on about this, I test stitch. You know, it's so important, because until you do it, you don't know what suits your stitching. So again, with the threads, how many strands to use, just try it out. Some stitchers choose to tent stitch with 3 strands on 18 count or 4 strands. You know, that sounds like a nightmare to me. I wouldn't choose to do it, but if that is what works best for you, then, you know, who am I to argue, really? So yeah, no magic formula, sorry about that, but test stitch is the answer. Before I go on about tent stitch and full cross, I just thought I'd mention the actual threads that you use with Heaven and Earth Designs. The majority of them are all charted for DMC. There are a few charts that are charted for anchor floss, because I think Michelle found that purples were better, the shades of purples suited the particular chart better. So, but for the majority of charts it's all DMC. A lot of new head stitchers get confused when they look at the chart and they see DMC 032. That is referring to Krennic number 32. It appears on all the charts as DMC. It's not DMC. The charting software that Michelle uses, for some reason, she can't change it, so that's how it's always listed. But DMC 032 is referring to Krennic number 4 braid. I can't remember the colour off the top of my head. It's probably pearl. That's the equivalent that I use in Petite Treasure braid. Now, that particular thread, as you know, I don't use in my Heaven and Earth Designs. I use the Petite Treasure braid alternative, but there are some stitchers that absolutely hate using metallic thread of any variety, so they choose to substitute that thread for perhaps another shade of white. So they might use, well, just plain white. They might use winter white, 3865. They might use bright white, B5200. So there's the potential there with the metallic thread to change that thread to something that better suits you. There are other crazy stitchers that for some reason decide to substitute the Krennic with DMC metallic. Enough said about that. Others perhaps try and use maybe 1 strand of DMC white with 1 strand of blending filament, or they might choose to use 2 strands of blending filament. So there's different sort of options that you can use with the metallic threads that some Heaven and Earth Designs charts utilise. The other thread that I changed, which I totally forgot to mention in my finishes, Heaven and Earth finishes video, was the black thread. After doing a bit of research, I think when I changed the thread that I used when I stitched my Hannah Lynn design, because obviously that uses tons of black, and I choose to use Anchor black instead of DMC black thread, and quite a few head stitchers do the same. The reasons for that is, I just found personally, I did a bit of test stitching, and I found that the black anchor thread gave a better coverage than the DMC. Now, as you probably all know, when you stitch with the darker DMC threads, they tend to be quite thin. For some reason, they're a lot thinner. It's probably something to do with the fact that obviously it takes a lot more dye to dye something darker, to dye especially black. Black is hard colour to dye. So obviously somewhere along the line in the dyeing process, it makes those particular threads a bit thinner. I personally, as I say, found that the anchor thread gave better coverage, and obviously if you're stitching quite a lot of black, especially if you're stitching pages of black, you will notice the coverage. Maybe you can see the white, see your fabric, a lot more show through. So I would recommend perhaps trying anchor black if you found that yourself. I've just found it to be better, so that's what I choose to use. The other thing to consider with threads is that regardless of what DMC say, they do have dyelots, and you might think that's not an issue, but I know of one fantastic stitcher who had a design which the top row of stitches was predominantly 939, dark navy blue. It was sort of sky, and so she stitched several pages and she ran out of 939, so she went to buy some more, as you would, started stitching with it and noticed that it was a slightly different, it wasn't like drastically different shade, but there was a definite difference. Now to most people they probably wouldn't notice, but as us stitchers often are, we're quite critical of our own work, and we know if there's a mistake, we know if something's wrong, and then it's all you can think about is when you look at that piece is to see that mistake. So she'd done all of that beautiful, beautiful stitching, and that project's now sort of been semi-abandoned because of the dyelot, the change in the dyelot. So I would recommend, if I can do that, that if you have in your charts that require several skeins of the same colour, especially if it's black or dark colours like 939 or the darker browns, and especially if you have to stitch large blocks of it at a time, I would definitely recommend buying all the threads at once, just for that peace of mind to avoid a potential dyelot issue. Obviously it doesn't happen all the time, but you can bet that it would happen if you hadn't done it that way. So yeah, that's just a note about dylots, which is something you might not have thought about before. What else can I say on the topic of threads? Nothing, I think I've said everything. Then of course you've got the option of whether you decide to do full crosses or whether you decide to do tent stitching. Now obviously again it's entirely up to you. Some cross stitchers don't like the idea of tent stitching, they think that it's cheating. That's absolutely fine. Obviously I don't feel that way, as you know. But again, for me, it all came down to how it looked on the fabric. I did the test stitching. I liked the look and the coverage of 2 strands tent stitched over 1 on 28 count, and also it cuts down on stitching time really, because for every tent stitch, 2 tent stitches equals 1 cross stitch, so you potentially can finish your designs quicker. So it's entirely up to you. Of course, the other reason why I chose to tent stitch is because I found that stitching 2/1 full cross on any count of fabric was too bulky for me, and I wanted to use 2 strands of fabric for the loop start, so that kind of swung my decision really on what I was happy to stitch on. Now with both the cross stitch and the tent stitch, there perhaps maybe some things to consider if you're stitching on even weave. Obviously with tent stitching, usually stitches tent stitch on the finer counts of fabrics. Doesn't quite work perhaps so well on HAED, even on 22 count, although again there are some stitches that work on 22 count of fabric, and obviously it looks fine to them and that's great. It's all about what looks good to you. I can't stress that enough. It's not about what I think is right or wrong or what any other stitcher thinks is right or wrong. It's about how it looks to you. So yes, if you're cross stitching on even weave, you might find you might need to slightly adjust the way you do your crosses. I'm going to attempt to explain this. I'm not sure if it will work, but we shall see. Now, although I don't stitch my Heaven and Earth designs over 1 on even weave, I have done quite a bit of over 1 stitching on even weave generally. With my Chatelaines, the butterflies are all stitched over 1 on even weave, and the phoenixes were all stitched over 1 on even weave, and I found that I had to actually change a bit how I stitch my crosses. So the way I stitch my crosses, this probably won't show up very well, but sometimes it might help because it's easier to see something than hear about it. The way I stitch my crosses is I start in the bottom left hand corner, and then I go up to the top right, and then I go down, and then go up to the top left, which is fine. It's a cross. Now, first of all, you have to imagine that I'm actually stitching over 1 on even weave. I thought there was no point in actually doing it over 1 because you wouldn't be able to see it, because you can probably barely see it stitched over 2. But anyway, just for illustrative purposes, imagine this is stitched over 1. Now, that becomes a problem if you're stitching over 1 on even weave, the order that I do the different legs of my crosses in. Because if you stitch from bottom left to top right, and then you go down, you go directly underneath your stitch, like that. What can happen when you stitch over 1 on even weave, especially if you've got quite a tight tension and you pull too hard, is you pull your thread, and that thread will actually slip down to be in the hole that you've come out of, if that makes sense. If it doesn't, and you've got a piece of even weave in your stash, get it out and look at it and you'll see what I mean. So that becomes an issue, and that's the way that I always stitch my crosses when I do them one at a time. So what I found that I had to do instead was I always start my crosses in the same place, so always bottom left to top right. But instead of starting the next leg directly underneath and have a risk of the thread slipping under the weave of the fabric, what I did was do the next leg from the top left to bottom right. And that reduces the risk of your cross, that leg of your cross, slipping through the weave of the fabric. So on the back of your work, instead of the line going down, as it would ordinarily when you do your crosses, going down, the line would go across, sort of almost making sure that that leg of your cross is sort of tucked in, really. I'm not explaining this very well. Obviously not having a good brain day today. But if you get out a piece of even weave and you have a go with that, you'll see what I mean. I'm not explaining this very well at all. It's sort of when you stitch your cross so that it goes like, you start there, so you go across the back of your fabric, there's a horizontal line on your fabric. It sort of locks the thread in, there's nowhere for it to go, it can't slip. So that's why I found when I was doing my chatelaines that I had to slightly adjust the way that I do my crosses for that reason, to try and prevent the thread from slipping under the weave of the fabric. Now you might find that's absolutely not an issue with you and your tension. You might find that you can quite easily do all your crosses without having to adjust the way you stitch, or you might be a stitcher that naturally stitches your crosses that way. Obviously we all know there is absolutely no right or wrong way to stitch your crosses. However you choose to stitch them, whatever leg you do first, absolutely not an issue as long as all your top legs go the same way. But I found, because of the way that I stitch, I don't know how many other stitchers stitch that way, do their crosses that way. It's always interesting to know what legs of crosses people do first. But I found, because of the way that I stitch, that I just had to make that slight adjustment to make sure my threads, my crosses, looked uniformed and correct on even weave when I stitched over one. So I'm sorry if that's really confused you. I didn't mean for it to confuse you, but it's one of those things you have to try out for yourself, and then you'll probably get what I mean. The other thing, of course, to take into consideration is tent stitching. Now there are 3 different ways you could tent stitch or half stitch. Some stitchers just do half crosses. Other stitchers like me do continental tent stitch. Other stitchers again do basket weave tent stitch, which I have absolutely no experience in whatsoever. Any of you that do canvas work or needlepoint will have a much better idea than me, so I can't at all comment on basket weave tent stitch because I haven't done it, so that wouldn't be fair for me to have an opinion on that, really. But again, that's something else for you to research. I might see if I can find a link about basket weave tent stitching and post that for you. Now here is an example. You all know what tent stitch looks like. Those top 2 rows, both tent stitch, but one's half cross stitch and the other is continental tent stitch. Now from the front they look identical, exactly the same, but they look different from the back. Just to illustrate this point, obviously your half cross stitches, half stitches, all will have nice vertical lines along the back. Continental tent stitch has diagonal lines going across the back. So although they look the same on the front, they look different on the back. Now you might ask, why did I choose to use continental tent stitch? The reason why I chose to use it is for the similar reason that I explained about the crosses. It's just that if you use continental tent stitch, it sort of locks your stitch in. There's no concern about your fabric. I keep mixing up fabric and thread. There's no reason for your thread to slip through the weave of your fabric, because by doing continental tent stitch, there's no way that can happen. Again, it's one of those things that's probably easier for you to do it yourself, have a little test stitch yourself to understand what I'm talking about. There's a stitcher that I know, she does her head designs in tent stitch. She uses half stitch, so half cross stitch. So she's got the vertical lines going along the back of her work, and she has absolutely no problem with, thread slipping through the weave of the fabric. Again, it's a personal thing. It depends on how you stitch, your tension, as to whether you would have issues with the thread slipping under the weave of the fabric. So basically this whole video consists of me saying, try it for yourself, because that's the only way you'll find out. It's all very well me saying it, but definitely, get a random bit of fabric on the count that you want to try and just have a little test stitch. That's the only way to do it, really. So those are a few things to take into consideration if you're thinking, do I do tent stitch, do I do cross stitch? Just bear those things in mind. I really hope I haven't confused you. I didn't mean to, but probably when I watch this back I'll think, oh my goodness, what on earth is she going on about? But anyway, let's leave that topic. The next one, people often ask, where do I start my design? Traditionally, if you believe that anything about cross stitch is traditional, people start in the middle, and a head design might be the first design where they thought, oh, I don't know about starting on the edge, I'm not quite sure about that. The answer to that question on where to start your design is you can start it wherever you want. There are head stitchers that start in the middle and work out like they have done with every other cross stitch. Some people choose, like me, they start at the top left and work across and down. Some stitchers start at the right and work across and down. Others start from the bottom 2 corners and work up. It's entirely up to you. Some stitchers choose where to start based on where the most interesting part of the design is. So if there's a lot of pages, blocks of colour, of the same colour, they might choose to start their design on the right hand side because that's where the interest is, or there's lots of reasons why people start in different areas, but there, again, no right or wrong, whatever works best for you. I always start in the top left hand corner. I just measure out my fabric. I measure 3 inches in and 3 inches down, and that's where I start. And as you know, I work in pages across, and that's the way I choose to work. Some people work in columns. Doesn't make any difference. It's whatever works best for you. That's the answer to all the questions, really. Sometimes it takes somebody to give you the confidence, to trust what you feel is best. Always go with what you feel is best. Doesn't matter what other people do. That's good advice for life sometimes. The next topic, gridding. You don't have to grid. I choose to grid because I'm of that nature. I find it really helps me. It's invaluable. I've always gridded for each of my head designs. I haven't always parked, but I've always gridded. I knew for me when I started these designs that would be essential. I find it really helps me to focus on a square, and I can match the crosses, or the stitches should I say, on my fabric to the pattern I've created by highlighting my chart. And I just find it really useful to know exactly where I am and what I'm stitching, and also it saves on counting, because that's always your worst fear, really, that you've miscounted and you have to frog stitches and rip them out. And I say this now, I've never really had a terrible counting error on my head designs, and that's really all down to gridding. I just find it really useful. Now, if you do decide to grid, if you think that might be something that will help you, there are several ways that you can grid. You can grid with pen. A lot of stitchers do that. I think Stitching May has a video about where she shows how she grids with pen. There are all sorts of different pens that you can buy, and I would definitely say test your fabric first to make sure the pen will come out when you wash it. I've heard some horror stories, which I probably shouldn't share with you really, but I'm going to anyway, just in case, of stitchers that have used a blue pen, like most of them are blue, or you can get some purple ones. They've used a pen to grid their fabric, they've washed out fine. They've then had the piece frames hanging on the wall, and then they looked at it one day and they saw that where the grid lines were that had washed out, they'd actually faded, sort of gone a yellow colour. Now, probably to any other person, they couldn't notice that slight change, but because she knew where the grid lines were, it's anytime she looked at that picture, that's all she could see, was these sort of yellowish lines against her white fabric that she'd used. Now obviously with Heaven and Earth designs, the majority of them are full coverage wall-to-wall fabric, so that doesn't really matter. But obviously if you chose to have the background removed or anything like that and you'd gridded your chart, and for whatever reason that particular brand of pen decided to do that, then that would be a nightmare. I'm slightly biased. I'm trying not to be biased. Pens are brilliant. You know, hundreds of stitches, use them. I don't, and the reason for that is because I'm a bit of a chicken and I don't like washing my finished pieces. So some of you have probably recoiled in horror at the thought of the fact that I don't do that. But as you've seen, and with my Heaven and Earth designs, I've used hand-dyed fabrics, I've used silks for one of them, and there's no way I was going to wash those at all. So I've always shied away from drawing on my stitching. It's a sort of control perfectionist freak in me. I can't bear the thought of it, and I don't like washing my fabric. So for me, I always chose to grid with thread. There's absolutely nothing wrong with pen. It's just me and the way that I am. So I always knew that I was going to grid with thread. Obviously there's different threads you can use for gridding. Some stitches use fishing line. You can use, you know, DMC thread or, you know, sewing thread if you want to. The only reason that I would be myself wary of doing that is obviously you could split the gridding thread as you stitch over it. You could accidentally catch the thread in your stitch, and then obviously when you go to pull out your gridding thread, you know, it could snag your stitches and that type of thing. So that is something to consider when you're thinking about, if you want to grid with thread, what type of thread to use. The type of thread that I grid my fabric with is called Sulky Sliver Metallic, not silver, as some stitches get confused. Sliver. I'll put a link down so you can see it. But basically it looks like this. And as you look at it, you can see it's like, it always reminds me of very, very fine curling ribbon that you might use to wrap up presents and gifts with. But the great thing about this thread is that you can't pierce it. It's impossible to pierce it. You just can't do it. And the other great thing about it is that it pulls out really easily from your stitching. Obviously when it's in your fabric, it's not going to fall out or anything, but you can just pull it out really easy. It doesn't snag at all. You know, I've had absolutely no issues with it. The only issue that some stitches have had is this thread comes in a variety of colours. I use the gold and the silver for mine. Some stitches have reported that the red metallic thread has bled onto their fabric. So I've always gone for the safe option, as is always the way with me, and I chose gold and silver to grid mine with. And this thread is brilliant for gridding. I find it so easy to pull out afterwards, and you can stitch over the top of it, you can stitch underneath it, you know, it's not a problem. I have found with gridding myself is that I still need to see the grid while I'm stitching, even on areas that I finished, and that's why for me the Magic Grid Aider and Magic Grid Even Weave that you can buy, I did start stitching something on that and I didn't like it at all, because I felt that I needed to see the grid at all times. I don't know why that is. I'm just obviously a freak that way, but I just found it so much easier to match up what I'd completed of a pattern at a glance, just looking at the grid on my fabric and looking at the grid on my chart. I just needed to see that grid. So that's again why I chose to grid with thread and not with pen, because obviously when you grid with pen you're stitching over the grid lines, and I don't know why, but I just found it essential for me to be able to see that grid all the time. But that's probably just me being strange. Yeah, so that's gridding. Again, entirely up to you whether you choose to grid. If you don't want to waste the time gridding and want to just get in and start, that's absolutely fine. Some stitches just count. I obviously can only count up to 10, so that's why I grid. But yeah, again, just an option, something for you to think about, something for you to consider. The next topic I'm going to try not to dwell on for too long, because it can do your head in, and that's parking. You all know, if you've watched my other videos, that I choose to park my threads, and as I've said before, if you don't like the look of parking or you can't get on with it, that's absolutely fine. Parking isn't for everybody. We all work in different ways. I am the control freak, obsessive type of person. So I found for me that parking actually is more organised, which probably some of you now are thinking, what are you on about? When I look at a parked thread, it looks a mess. But to me it doesn't. And there's one very important reason for that, which I will go into. But, yeah, so just in case you don't know what I'm on about with parked threads, here is the one that looks the worst. This is daffodils. So obviously lots of parked threads on there. Some stitchers look at that and they think, oh my goodness, how do you know one thread from another? That's an absolute nightmare. Which, if you don't know about parking, yeah, that's a pretty, good conclusion to come to. But the golden rule for parking is this. Always, when you park your thread, always park it in the same place for the beginning leg of your stitch. So I'll show you what I mean with this thread. So pretend that this thread here has been parked on a heaven and earth design. Now when you look at it, you think, well, what stitch is that for? Because of course it can be the stitch that goes that way, it can be for a stitch that goes that way, or it can be for a stitch that goes that way, or a stitch that goes that way. But when I look at it, I know instantly where that stitch is going, because I always park my threads in the bottom left corner of the stitch. So for me, as soon as I see that, I know that that thread is going to be going in that direction. Obviously I tent stitch, so that cuts down where the thread can go for a half stitch. But that is the important, and that is the key to parking, to be consistent in where you park your threads. Now it doesn't matter whether you park your threads and for you that means that you'll always start your stitch that way. It doesn't matter as long as you're consistent, and that's how people who park know what threads belong to which stitch. So again, for me, when I see that, I know instantly that I'm going to be stitching that colour in the stitch that goes from the bottom left to the top right. So I hope that's made sense and hasn't confused anybody. If you have any more questions, please ask and I will clarify anything. The other thing that I do with parking as well, as another safety measure, is when I mark my chart, I mark two things. I mark in one colour the stitches I've completed, and I mark in another colour the threads that I've parked. Just as an extra sort of, check really. And that way, perhaps if I come across a colour and I think, ooh, I'm not sure if that's the colour it should be, and I can check my chart, see the thread that I've highlighted as being parked, and then I can get the bobbin out. On some occasions I've done this, get the bobbin out of my bobbin box, look at it against the thread that I've said that I've parked in that space, just to make sure that it is the right colour. But once you get into the flow of parking, that doesn't really become an issue, because you always park your thread at the same place in each stitch. Now obviously, as you can tell I'm a floss licker, I apologise. Now obviously with me, I tent stitch, and I can't thread my needle and talk at the same time. So with tent stitching, you sort of work, well this is what I do, you work across one way and then work back the other. So as I've said, when I've got a parked thread, I always know that that thread is going to go from bottom left to top right, like that. Now sometimes when I get to a parked thread and I'm tent stitching, obviously, I don't want to start my thread from that position. In the flow of my parking, it's when you're going the opposite. So when I'm stitching from left to right, this is when this situation happens. So now I should be going there like that. But obviously, if I'm stitching in this direction, it doesn't work, because if I then go to start my next stitch on the back of my work, there's a little vertical stitch there, which isn't right. They should all be going diagonally. So in that situation, all I would do, so if my thread's parked there, I would just alter my thread so that I can start in the right place. So this is going to confuse everybody, I'm really sorry. So although my threads are always parked in the bottom left hand corner, sometimes because I tent stitch, I need to alter the direction of where I start that tent stitch, so I might need to start it from the top right, but I will still always park my thread in the top left. I will just alter the position when I get to that particular parked thread. So that's probably really confused you now. But I will say, I've said it before, when I started parking, I didn't actually read any of the guides or watch any videos. It's something I came to quite naturally in my stitching. I'll be honest with you, the written guides of parking I never found I couldn't quite understand, you know, to say the A goes to B and then you do stitch C, and it didn't make any sense in my mind. Videos can be quite helpful if you're a visual person, but you will find that people park differently. For example, when I park in a 10 by 10 grid, I will do all the stitches in that colour, and then I will park that thread. Let's use this one because it's simpler, because there's less threads to look at. So I will park my thread in the next stitch of that colour, either in the bottom, even in the 10 by 10 block underneath, or to the 10 by 10 block to the right. I try not to carry my park threads too far. Other stitches will not come up in a space that's been occupied by another stitch, so they will work row by row of stitches at a time. So we all do it differently. I basically cross-country stitch in a 10 by 10 grid and then park my thread directly underneath if there's a colour if that colour is used again, or I will park my thread directly to the right hand side block if that colour is used again. If it's not used again, I'll just finish off the thread. There are stitches that finish off their threads at the front, finish off their threads at the front of their work. I don't. I have done that in the past. I do it occasionally, because obviously as you work down a design you will automatically stitch over those threads. But as I don't really do that so much, I can't really show you an example, but you'll see plenty of examples on YouTube or in people's whip and finish pictures that will show that. Usually you'll see all their parked threads, and then you'll see these little fluffy bits at the side, and that's just where they've finished their threads off at the front. They do it basically to try and reduce the bulk on the back of your work for starting and finishing threads, which again is another reason why I use the loop method to start. It cuts down on that bulk. But I do, when I finish my threads, I do usually just run them underneath and finish stitches on the back. So that's parking. It is confusing, but again, it's one of those things I think you've got to sit down and work out for yourself. People do it in different ways, and sometimes seeing it and doing it for yourself can be more useful than even watching somebody's video on it. So if you want me to elaborate any more on parking, just let me know. But as I say, the golden rule for parking is to always park your thread in the same part of the stitch that you're going to be, doing first, the first leg of your cross or your tent stitch. And that's the way you'll always know what direction that stitch is going in. So I'm hoping that that's helped, although I can't help but think that it's probably confused you more, so I apologise if it has. It was meant with good intentions. That's basically it really. We've covered fabric, threads, where to start, tent stitch or cross stitch, gridding and parking. The only other small point to mention is page lines. Now some stitchers have had the experience where when they finished their piece of work, it's become quite obvious where the pages were because of the way that they've stitched. Now what I do, let's find a good example. Let's use daffodils. To avoid that problem, the best thing that you can do is to make sure you don't have a straight line finish. So here's a whole page, and you'll see that what I've done on that page is not a straight line. There's all sorts of, different stitches, it doesn't finish on a straight edge. And that's the best advice I could offer, really. Is to try, and where you can, even if you go across, you stitch page by page, just go across a little bit into the next page, just so you've got broken lines really. And I'm not saying necessarily that if you do stitch a whole page and finish it, you know, straight, that you'll have that issue of page lines, but it is a worry. You know, if you imagine stitching for months and months, years and years on a piece, you finish it and you can see the page lines even if nobody else can. Sometimes you can get the page lines out by washing. Some stitchers have had to sort of stitch on the back almost, do some like whip stitches through their work, different things like that. But to avoid that issue altogether and to avoid that concern, just always try and extend your stitching a little bit into the next page, so you have sort of, you know, a wiggly finish on a page, for want of a better expression. So then you don't have to worry about having page lines showing on your work. So I anticipate that this video is quite long. I hope you found it interesting. I don't think I'm having a very good day today at explaining things, so I apologise for that. But if you've got any further questions, you want me to elaborate on any more points, please just, you know, put in a little comment. As I've said before, there's no such thing as a silly question. If you don't know the answer, you don't know the answer, and there's no harm in asking. I don't, you know, the simplest of questions to me might be the most difficult questions to you, and if I know the answer, I'll give you the answer. I'm quite happy to do that, because we all started somewhere, and wouldn't want any stitcher to be sat there thinking, oh, I don't want to look silly by asking this question. I'd much rather you know the answer. I'm not going to think you're silly. I'm just going to think you're interested and you want to do your best. You want to produce your best work. So that's why you ask questions, and that's how you learn. You know, I've asked some stupid questions in my time, I'm pretty sure, and you know, those answers have stayed with me, probably because of that reason. So I will finish that video here. I apologise again for the length, and if there's only one thing you take away from this video, it's the fact that test stitch. I can't emphasise that enough. And the other thing is, it's what looks best to you, not what looks best to me or any other stitcher. As long as you are happy with the fabric you've chosen, the number of strands of floss you've chosen to use, and you love the pattern you're stitching, you know, that's fabulous, because that means you'll really enjoy stitching it. And at the end of the day, what other reason is there to stitch other than for enjoyment and fun? So thank you if you've got to the end of this video. You are a complete star, and I hope that this has helped some of you out there who are new to Heaven and Earth Designs and are a bit anxious about starting them because of all those different options you've got. I hope that this video has helped you. So a huge thank you for watching and getting to the end of this video, and happy stitching.